Imagine waking up in 79 AD, the sun already warm on your face, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of Pompeii. Your morning rituals are about to begin, but they aren't just about, getting clean. They're fundamentally about how you present yourself to the world. Because your very existence, your safety, your opportunity, everything, is profoundly shaped by appearance. Maybe your very livelihood depends on being beautiful, on being desired. And in a society that doesn't quite have a word for gay, as we understand it, your position might be surprisingly precarious, even, disposable. We're talking about a young, perhaps effeminate man, navigating the vibrant, complex, and ultimately doomed city of ancient Pompeii. Welcome to the Deep Dive. You sent us a truly fascinating stack of sources, a collection of articles, research papers, even archaeological notes. Really compelling stuff, and today we're taking a deep dive into what daily life might have actually been like for a very specific individual in Pompeii, just moments before Mount Vesuvius changed everything forever. We're not just going to, gaze upon the grand temples or ponder the tragic plaster casts of victims, although those are incredibly powerful. We're peeling back the layers to truly understand the lived experience of someone whose sexuality and gender expression place them in a unique, often precarious, and deeply nuanced position within Roman society. This isn't just about broad historical strokes, it's about getting granular, about trying to walk a day in a sandals, so to speak.
Exactly. And this isn't just a quirky historical anecdote or a salacious look at ancient practices just for the sake of it. This deep dive is about uncovering a crucial, often overlooked truth that queer lives weren't simply invented in modern times. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. They've always existed in myriad forms across cultures and epochs. The difference is, in ancient Rome, these lives weren't often recorded in grand histories or noble texts. Unless, that is, they were deemed scandalous, maybe sacred in some contexts, or perhaps most tellingly for our purposes today, etched into stone as fleeting pieces of graffiti. We're here to explore how what we might today label as queerness in all its varied expressions, how it fit into the intricate social, sexual, and power structures of ancient Rome, especially for those who found themselves on the margins of society.
So what does this all mean for us today? Our mission really is to trace a single day from the first light of dawn to the quiet of dusk through the hypothetical eyes of a young, effeminate male in Pompeii. We're going to ask some challenging questions, I think. How did beauty, social class, and the complex currents of desire intersect for someone who, if they lived today, might be called a twink, maybe? But in Roman terms, was something far more nuanced, perhaps even fraught with danger. We'll try to uncover the surprisingly rigid beauty standards of the time, the fascinating and often brutal power dynamics where sex was distinct from identity, and the surprising, often contradictory ways that public and private lives intertwined for such an individual. It's a journey into a past that feels both alien and, I think, in its human complexity, remarkably familiar. Okay, let's unpack this and truly set the scene. Imagine yourself standing in Pompeii in 79 AD. Our sources paint a truly vivid, almost sensory picture of this bustling, vibrant city nestled there on the Bay of Naples. It was a place teeming with life, a vital port town and agricultural center. Busy. And then, in a horrifying, almost unfathomable twist of fate, this entire world was frozen in time by the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. When you walk through its unearthed ruins today, it's not just crumbling stones and silent streets. It's an incredibly detailed, living snapshot of an ancient civilization. What our sources emphasize is the sheer detail. It's incredible. You can almost hear the clamor of the grand temples, the hushed voices within opulent villas, the clanking tools in the humble workshops of artisans. You can practically smell it. The lively marketplaces would have been a cacophony of sound, a mix of rich perfumes, cooking aromas, and perhaps, some less pleasant smells too, let's be honest. It's a city pulsating with the everyday rhythm of life suddenly stopped, mid-breath almost. What makes Pompeii so utterly unique for historians and archaeologists are the carbonized remains, and of course the plaster casts of the victims, perfectly preserving their final moments. These aren't just general historical texts or abstract theories. They offer an unparalleled, almost instantaneous snapshot of the inhabitants' routines and the fabric of daily life.
It's truly extraordinary. It really is. This level of preservation allows us to reconstruct daily life with an incredible granular detail that's usually impossible for ancient history. We're talking about bakeries with bread literally found still in the ovens, shops that were open for business midday, people frozen in specific postures mid-sentence, mid-task. This synchronous, detailed evidence gives us an incredibly rich and tangible backdrop for understanding the narrative of an individual rather than just broad strokes of a civilization. And this detailed backdrop is absolutely essential because the societal structure of Pompeii, like all Roman cities, was a profoundly complex tapestry. It was intricately woven with diverse strands of status and class that dictated nearly everything for its inhabitants. At the very top, you had the affluent elite, the landowners, the politicians, the high-ranking officials. They enjoyed incredibly lavish lifestyles and wielded immense political and economic power, obvious perhaps. Beneath them were the industrious merchants and skilled artisans, forming a middle stratum that, while perhaps not as powerful, still had opportunities for wealth accumulation and social influence. Sort of a middle class. Then the vast majority. Common laborers, shopkeepers, and freedmen, former slaves, who still often depended on their patrons. And crucially, at the very bottom was a truly significant population of enslaved individuals. They formed the true unseen gears of the city's economy. Absolutely fundamental. This hierarchy wasn't just theoretical. It dictated everything from where you lived, what you ate, how you dressed. And most relevant to our deep dive today, who you could have sexual relationships with, and the profound social repercussions of those relationships, particularly for someone like our subject.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and a bit counterintuitive for our modern minds, I think. The term twink, as we use it today, describes a young, often slender, effeminate gay man. That's the modern usage. But in ancient Rome, gay or homosexual as identity categories, as we understand them, meaning a fixed sexual orientation or identity, they just didn't exist. Not like that. Our sources are incredibly clear on this fundamental point. Instead, male-male sexual relationships were understood primarily through a penetrated binary. This is such a crucial distinction, isn't it? What exactly does that mean, and why is it so fundamentally different from our modern understanding of identity and sexuality?
It's a seismic difference. Yeah, absolutely vital to grasp. In this Roman framework, the active role in sex, the penetrative role, was unequivocally associated with masculinity and dominance. Romans called this virilitas. And virilitas wasn't just about physical manliness. It encompassed moral virtue, self-control, and the assertion of power. It was about being a proper Roman man. To be virilis was to be a man in full. Conversely, the passive role, the penetrative role, was intrinsically linked to femininity and submission. Weakness, essentially. And this association held true, importantly, irrespective of the gender of the individuals involved. That's key. So for a freeborn Roman citizen, displaying militia, which meant effeminacy in demeanor, dress, or character, or even worse, being the passive partner in any sexual act, was profoundly stigmatized. It was seen as a severe, almost emasculating lack of virilitas. The shame wasn't about who you desired, but about performing power in the sexual act itself. You were defined by your role, not your object of desire. It's a completely different mindset.
That's a fascinating paradox, though. So, while being passive was profoundly shameful for a freeborn man, our sources reveal a startling flexibility when it came to the active partner. Okay? Young males, typically between, 12 and 20 years old, were considered perfectly acceptable sexual partners for older Roman men, provided that these younger males were of lower social status. That's the catch. We're talking about enslaved individuals, freedmen who still held a dependent status, prostitutes or actors, people considered socially inferior. And it wasn't just tolerated. Our sources suggest there was even a widespread cultural expectation for older Roman men, especially those of higher status, to seek these kinds of relationships. As a natural assertion of their virilitas, this is truly mind-boggling for us today, isn't it? What does this cultural expectation actually entail? How did it manifest in daily life?
It's a key point, yeah. This wasn't merely a private indulgence hidden away. It was a societal norm, often unspoken but deeply ingrained. The evidence supporting this comes from a variety of sources. Philosophical treatises discussing proper conduct, satirical poetry mocking those who failed to act as proper Roman men, and, significantly, the widespread visual and textual evidence from places like Pompeii itself, the frescoes, the graffiti. For a respected Roman man, having a young, lower-status male partner was not only common, but also an accepted way to demonstrate his power and virility. It reinforced his standing. It was an assertion of his masculinity through penetration, regardless of the gender of the recipient. It contrasted sharply with, say, Greek pederasty, which often involved a mentor-mentee relationship with freeborn boys that was expected to transition to heterosexual marriage eventually. Roman practice, particularly for the elite, seems more about pure assertion of social dominance, status display. You might see older men with their the boys in public, not necessarily displaying affection, but as a subtle display of status, much like showing off any other valuable possession. This expectation wasn't ritualized like a marriage ceremony, obviously, but it permeated social interactions and attitudes. It was just part of the background fabric of life for the elite.
Okay, so this raises an important question then. Who exactly would fit our modern twink archetype in this ancient Roman context? Given these very specific social and sexual dynamics, these rules about status and role, Roman society certainly had figures that superficially at least, seemed to align with aspects of that description, even if the social meaning was entirely different.
Precisely. If we try to find parallels, there are a few distinct figures we can look at. For instance, there was the puer delicatus. That translates literally as something like an exquisite or dainty boy. This was a child slave, often prepubescent, specifically chosen by his master for his beauty, his delicate features, often exploited for sexual pleasure. Our sources are unambiguous. This was a perfectly normal reality for many wealthy Romans. That phrase itself is chilling. It was a systematized, institutionalized practice within the domestic sphere, deeply rooted in the power dynamics of slavery. The existence of these boys speaks volumes about the commodification of beauty and the sexual exploitation inherent in the Roman slave system. Then you have the Cinaedus. This was typically an adult male, distinguished by extreme effeminacy, who was often, though not exclusively, associated with being a passive sexual partner. The term itself, derived from the Greek Cinaedus, was widely recognized in Roman society. And while it described a distinct social type, it very frequently carried heavily derogatory connotations. It was an insult. We see it used in biting satire, on stage, and perhaps most viscerally scrawled as mocking graffiti in places like Pompeii, often specifically targeting individuals by name. Public shaming. So, if we map our twink archetype onto Roman society, they likely correspond to a pathicus, a general term for a passive partner, or more specifically, a Cinaedus, if they were effeminate, and perhaps even a performer. Or, most commonly, if enslaved, they would fit the description of a puer delicatus. The crucial overarching point here is that for a freeborn Roman man, being the passive partner in a sexual act was an utterly severe social transgression, a disaster. It would lead to immense stigma, public mockery, accusations of infamia, legal dishonor, and potentially political ruin. This fundamental distinction between freeborn and enslaved status and between active and passive roles profoundly shaped the daily experiences and vulnerabilities of anyone who might fit this archetype.
Right, so let's embark on that day in the life. Let's try and picture it. Life in Pompeii, for almost everyone, began early. Dictated by the sun's rhythm, really, as artificial light wasn't common or cheap for daily use. For most citizens who lacked private water access, imagine that. No running water in your home, no private bathroom. The day would typically begin with a trip to one of the many public fountains, fetching water for washing and drinking. So right away, it's a communal activity, setting the tone for a very public, interconnected existence. Roman society, perhaps surprisingly to some, was notably stringent about cleanliness. They genuinely valued personal hygiene, often more so than many cultures even centuries later. People didn't just wash, they cleansed their bodies using olive oil. They'd apply it and then scrape it off with a strigil that's a curved metal tool and rinse with water and sponges. And public baths weren't just about getting clean, they were central social hubs, vital venues for daily life, bustling with activity from dawn right through the afternoon.
Exactly. And for someone like our subject, a young, possibly effeminate male grooming in Rome was indeed a complex social statement. It was loaded with significant meaning. While facial shaving was relatively common practice, the widespread removal of body hair for men was less common. It could even be seen as an oddity in some instances. Our sources mention, for example, that Julius Caesar's habit of plucking body hair was considered unusual. It highlights a general Roman value for a certain degree of, hairy masculinity. However, and this is a key point for our subject, effeminate men did engage in body hair removal, a process called depilation. They might even use cosmetics like skin whiteners or kohl for the eyes. But these practices were often viewed as improper, as signs of militia or unmanliness, inviting public criticism and social scorn. Hair was generally kept short and neat, though it's interesting that even Emperor Nero, always one to challenge norms, apparently popularized curled hair among men for a time. So the choices made in personal grooming for a young, effeminate male in Pompeii were far from merely aesthetic. They weren't just fashion, they carried significant social implications. Adopting practices associated with effeminacy would visibly mark an individual as deviating from traditional norms. It invited public criticism and reinforced their perceived unmanliness. This demonstrates a constant daily tension between personal expression and relentless societal expectation. You couldn't just groom how you liked without sending a very clear and potentially dangerous message about who you were or who people thought you were.
And dress, like grooming, also spoke volumes about your identity and your status in Pompeian society. So walking billboard, in a way. A simple belted tunic, typically covering the knees, was common everyday wear for most people. Practical. But the toga, that cumbersome, heavy piece of draped cloth, was far more than just clothing. It was a powerful symbol. It was generally reserved for public occasions and loudly signified Roman citizenship and, crucially, high status. You had to be someone important to wear it properly. Working class men and slaves, on the other hand, generally wore simpler, coarser tunics, often made of darker, undyed wool, and frequently hitched higher for freer movement during manual labor. But what stands out to me here, and it's a truly critical detail for someone like our subject, especially if they were freeborn, is the bulla and the toga praetexta. The bulla was a small round amulet worn around the neck by upper-class boys until they came of age, like a locket almost. The toga praetexta was a white toga with a broad purple stripe, also worn by these boys on formal occasions. Why were these so important? Because they signified freeborn status. That was the key. This was vital in highly public spaces, like the bustling forum or the crowded public bath, to avoid being mistaken for a slave, which could be disastrous. For a young effeminate male, being perceived as either effeminate or enslaved carried profound implications for their safety and vulnerability, especially sexual vulnerability. The visual markers of status were not just fashion statements, they were lines of defense, literally marking who was off limits for certain kinds of exploitation, at least legally.
And moving inside the household now, the morning meal, what Romans called intaculum or breakfast, was typically a simple affair for most Pompeians. Usually just bread and cheese, maybe some olives, sometimes supplemented with vegetables or eggs. Nothing elaborate for most people. For our subject, depending on his social standing, this could mean a hurried bite on the go, or perhaps a more formal, if still sparse, meal within a household setting. But the household itself was a microcosm of Roman power dynamics. It operated under the formidable authority of the paterfamilias, the eldest male who wielded immense power, almost absolute power. It's hard for us to grasp, but he even held the power of life and death over his family unit, including enslaved members. Marriages were generally arranged, often between men in their 30s and girls in their early teens. Primarily strategic alliances for family benefit, not based on love. And boys usually received their education either from a tutor at home, if the family could afford it, or by attending public schools, preparing them for future roles in the army, politics, or various trades.
And a critical detail, one that's maybe easy to overlook when we picture ancient Rome, is the pervasive presence of slaves. They were just everywhere. Omnipresent features of Roman households, providing labor and services across virtually all social strata, from the grandest villas, obviously, but even in poorer families and among freed slaves themselves. They truly formed the unseen gears of the city's economy, the silent engine that powered Roman life. How deeply did this reliance on enslaved labor permeate society, even beyond the really wealthy households?
Oh, it was absolutely fundamental, even in quite modest homes. A small shopkeeper might have one or two enslaved individuals to help with daily chores, run errands, manage the shop. Whereas elite households could have hundreds, literally hundreds, each specialized in different tasks: cooks, cleaners, tutors, secretaries, body servants. This profound reliance on slavery meant that for a young, effeminate male who was enslaved, his daily existence was defined by profound vulnerability and complete dependence on his master's will. Total lack of autonomy. Within this omnipresent system, in affluent households, the puer delicatus, the exquisite or dainty boy, was a common fixture. This was a young, attractive slave boy, often prepubescent, specifically chosen by his master for his beauty, his delicate features, his potential for sexual and aesthetic pleasure. Our sources confirm this was a perfectly normal reality for many wealthy Romans. Again, that phrase is just jarring, but it reflects the normalization of this exploitation. The presence of pueri delicati in affluent households reveals a normalized, albeit deeply disturbing aspect of male-male sexual relationships within the domestic sphere. It was built into the system. For a young, effeminate male who was enslaved and forced into this role, their life was one of extreme vulnerability and constant negotiation of their master's unpredictable desires. Daily uncertainty. This isn't just about labor, it's about bodily autonomy, or rather the complete lack thereof. Your body wasn't your own. However, what's fascinating here, and a truly complex paradox, is that while profoundly vulnerable, this role could, albeit precariously, offer a rare path to potential manumission freedom, and in even rarer cases, inheritance. What does that really mean in practice? How could that happen?
That's an extraordinary point, an almost perverse silver lining, if you can even call it that, to such a brutal system. For an enslaved puer delicatus, what kind of power dynamics were at play there that could possibly lead to manumission or inheritance? Was this common, or are we talking about truly exceptional outcomes? And what were the psychological implications of such a path for someone whose very existence was rooted in exploitation?
It was certainly not common, very rare in fact, which makes it all the more significant when it did occur. The power dynamic was always tilted decisively in the master's favor. Always. The master could grant freedom or include the puer delicatus in his will, but this was entirely at his discretion. His whim, basically. Often it might be tied to a particularly strong bond that developed over time, perhaps a long period of faithful service, or maybe a master's advancing age and desire to provide for those close to him, even if they were slaves. We have examples, albeit rare, from inscriptions and legal documents of masters legally freeing and even adopting their pueri delicati, sometimes making them heirs, especially if they had no legitimate children of their own. But even then, the relationship carried a lifelong shadow. A freedman, a libertus, was still tied to his former master as a patron. He owed his patron loyalty and service, obligations remained. The psychological implications would be immense, surely. Imagine a life where your value, your very safety, and any hope for a future is entirely dependent on another person's desire and whim, on being pleasing. This opportunity was born from coercion, a fragile glimmer of hope in a profoundly dehumanizing system. It's perhaps a testament to the complexities of human relationships, that even under the most oppressive conditions, a semblance of affection, or at least dependence that looked like affection, could sometimes develop.
So, as we've established, Pompeian society was rigidly hierarchical. The elite landowners, politicians enjoying lavish lifestyles at the top, then a middle stratum of merchants and artisans, doing pretty well maybe, then common citizens, laborers, shopkeepers, and, as we just discussed, at the very bottom were the slaves, enduring lives of uncompensated toil and profound vulnerability. While social mobility was generally quite limited by rigid class structures and lineage, it wasn't totally impossible, was it? The city's vibrant economic vitality did provide some opportunities for successful merchants and skilled artisans to accumulate wealth and maybe rise somewhat within their own strata.
Yes, to some extent. It wasn't easy, but a particularly successful craftsman or merchant could gain considerable wealth and influence, maybe even eventually gain entry into local politics at a lower level. Manumission also offered a path upwards for some slaves, though freedmen still faced social prejudice, but overall your birth status largely determined your life path. And this social class profoundly dictated almost every aspect of a young, effeminate male's life, from their daily routines, their education, their job prospects, to even how they were perceived sexually and the risks they faced. Indeed. This rigid stratification meant that our young, effeminate male faced two distinct potential paths, broadly speaking, each with its own vulnerabilities and the adaptations required to survive. If he was freeborn, he would certainly face immense social stigma for his effeminacy or for being perceived as a passive partner, which, as we've stressed, was a significant social transgression for a freeborn Roman man. It brought shame. However, he would retain fundamental citizen rights, certain legal protections, and a degree of autonomy that an enslaved person utterly lacked. He might face mockery, ostracization, maybe even political attacks if he came from a prominent family, but his body and freedom were legally his own. That's a huge difference. Conversely, if he were an enslaved puer delicatus, he would be legally vulnerable, completely subject to his master's will, with essentially no legal recourse against abuse or exploitation. His body was his master's property, period. Yet, paradoxically, his beauty and effeminacy might, as we just discussed, be a valuable asset within that system. It could potentially lead to a favored position within the household, perhaps better treatment than field slaves or manual laborers, or in those rare instances, even manumission. So, while both positions were precarious, intensely difficult, they presented entirely different challenges and required distinct survival strategies to navigate daily life in Pompeii. One might be shamed but legally free, the other potentially favored within the system but utterly unfree, living entirely at the mercy of another.
Okay, let's move into the working day. As the Roman Empire developed, occupations became increasingly specialized, right? And Pompeii, as a bustling port city, was no exception. Shops were open and markets buzzed with activity from early morning, supporting a wide array of professions. We're talking skilled craftsmen, potters, metalworkers, weavers, bakers, alongside shopkeepers selling everything imaginable, laborers hauling goods, various service providers. Young men from lower social classes typically began apprenticing in trades from a young age, learning a craft that would likely define their entire working life. But for an effeminate young man, how did these occupational realities play out? Did his perceived nature limit or perhaps even open certain doors?
That's a critical question. And yes, what's fascinating here is how perceived gender expression could actually influence occupational opportunities, sometimes creating very specific, if often marginalized, niches. While physically demanding labor construction, farming, dock work might be less common or less desirable for individuals perceived as effeminate, or perhaps they were steered away from it. Roles in entertainment, Personal service, like being a valet or attendant, or even sexual commerce could become more accessible or even be the only options available or forced upon them. Take the Cinaedus figure, for example. We've mentioned the stigma, the mockery in literature, and graffiti. But the Cinaedus could also function as a professional performer. They were associated with specific, often suggestive dances and a racy, sometimes satirical, poetic speech style. You could perhaps imagine them on a small stage in a tavern, or hired for entertainment at a private dinner party. Their movements fluid, their wit sharp, perhaps drawing both laughs and sneers from the audience. In fact, our sources show financial records from Roman Egypt, not Pompeii, but indicative of wider Roman practice, providing solid evidence that Cinaedoi, the Greek equivalent of Cinaedi, were paying taxes. They were listed alongside other performers, like pipe players, receiving payments for their services. This strongly suggests a recognized, albeit stigmatized, profession within the entertainment sector. For someone like our subject, this hints at a potential economic niche for effeminate men. It offered a degree of integration into society and a means of livelihood, despite the societal derision they might face constantly. It wasn't about being fully accepted or respected in the mainstream sense, but about finding a way to exist, earn money, and perhaps even to thrive financially within those very specific, narrow boundaries. Often by embracing or being forced to embrace the very effeminacy that society simultaneously condemned. A strange paradox.
And as the morning progressed into the busier parts of the day, Pompeii's public spaces became absolutely central to daily life. Far more than just places to pass through on your way somewhere else. The Forum, for example, served as the city's religious, political, and commercial heart. It was the main public square, the central downtown area, where citizens gathered for all sorts of services, banking, legal proceedings, religious ceremonies, plus political discussions, and just everyday commerce, shopping, meeting people. It was a constant hub of activity, a vibrant stage for Roman life.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And beyond the Forum, the numerous bathhouses were fundamental social institutions, hugely important. They were far more than just places for hygiene, though cleanliness was certainly paramount, as you said. They were vibrant centers for relaxation, for exercise. Many had gyms or palaestrae attached, and for incredibly lively conversation. Gossip central, basically. What's crucial to understand is that they were accessible to virtually all social classes. Even slaves could often attend, maybe at different times or in separate sections. It was where gossip and political discussions flowed freely, where business deals were struck, where friendships were forged or fell apart. Roman men often spent a good chunk of their afternoons there, moving between the various heated pools, caldarium, steam rooms, sudatorium, warm rooms, tepidarium, and cool plunge pools, frigidarium, getting massages. Swimming was also a very popular activity, especially among Roman boys, making these spaces even more bustling and sometimes chaotic. These were democratic spaces in their accessibility, perhaps, but as you alluded to earlier, definitely not always in their social dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. This raises that important question again. How did an effeminate young man, particularly if he was freeborn, navigate these highly public, highly judgmental spaces? We talked about the bulla, that amulet worn by freeborn boys. Our sources stress that this served as a crucial visual signal of their status, preventing them from being mistaken for slaves. How crucial was this small detail really? And how did it affect their personal safety and vulnerability in places like the crowded, often boisterous public baths?
It was absolutely critical. You could almost say it was a matter of life or death in some situations, or certainly freedom versus potential enslavement, safety versus extreme vulnerability. For a freeborn boy, wearing the bulla and, when appropriate, the toga praetexta, was an undeniable declaration of his citizen status, a shield. In a society where appearance dictated so much, being mistaken for a slave could have dire consequences. Physical assault, sexual exploitation, or even illegal enslavement were real risks. For an effeminate freeborn male, this visual signaling was even more vital because his effeminacy might already put him under suspicion or scrutiny. It could potentially lead to him being stereotyped as a Cinaedus or a passive partner, and thus automatically associated with lower status or availability for exploitation. These public spaces, the forum, the streets, the baths, were arenas of constant social observation and judgment, everyone watching everyone else. This made an effeminate male vulnerable to scrutiny, mockery, or even outright verbal abuse, as evidenced by the widespread derogatory Cinaedus graffiti found throughout Pompeii, sometimes naming names. So, while these spaces offered social connection and necessary public functions, they also demanded a constant performance of one's exact place in the hierarchy. A careful navigation of potentially hostile gazes and judgments was essential for survival.
And beyond the daily bustle of work and baths, Pompeii also featured a dedicated entertainment district. Quite sophisticated, really. It boasted 2 theaters, one larger open-air one for tragedies and comedies, and another smaller roofed one, the Odeon. probably for musical performances or recitals, more intimate. And then there was the Grand Amphitheater, a massive structure which served as the primary venue for huge public events, including the notoriously brutal gladiatorial games, elaborate staged animal hunts, venationes, and public executions, mass entertainment, Roman style.
Yes, and these spectacles were not just entertainment in our sense. They were highly anticipated, almost ritualistic events for the populace. They were deeply embedded in the culture, and they served to strongly reinforce Roman ideals of virilitas, dominance, and martial prowess, control over life and death. The image of the conquering gladiator, the fearless beast hunter, the stoic executioner, these figures embodied everything a Roman man was supposed to aspire to be. Strength, control, lack of fear. For an effeminate male, attending these events could certainly create a sense of profound dissonance, a feeling of not measuring up, or immense pressure to conform to conventional masculinity, even if only outwardly, cheering along with the crowd. The very atmosphere was saturated with the celebration of a very specific, aggressive kind of masculinity that they might not embody or aspire to. Conversely, and perhaps ironically, the very presence of Cinaedus as professional performers in the theaters or other public venues suggests a different, albeit highly specific and often mocked form of integration into public life. While often disdained, they had a recognized role in the public spectacle, demonstrating the complex Roman capacity for both disdain and, in a way, inclusion. It's complicated.
Absolutely. Okay, as the day wore on, perhaps as dusk began to fall, the intimate landscape of Pompeii revealed itself, the private lives, the hidden interactions. Let's unpack this further, because our sources are very clear on a fundamental, perhaps uncomfortable point for modern readers. The Latin language had no specific terms for heterosexual or homosexual as modern identity categories. This is so crucial to keep repeating. Instead, sexual relationships were understood purely through that active, penetrative masculine role versus the passive, penetrated feminine role binary. This is the fundamental lens. Everything filters through this active, passive, dominant, submissive framework.
Absolutely. And within this framework, the rules of engagement were starkly different from our modern understanding of orientation. Freeborn Roman men were largely at liberty to engage in sexual activity with male slaves, former slaves, prostitutes, both male and female, or actors without incurring any significant social discrimination. The crucial condition, the non-negotiable part, was that they consistently maintained the active, penetrative role. That was paramount. This was seen not as a deviation or a gay act in our sense, but rather as a demonstration of their virilitas and their inherent ability to conquer or dominate others. It reinforced their social status and power. There was even that cultural expectation, as we discussed, for older Romans to seek relationships with young men, specifically those between 12 and 20, provided, once again, that the younger male was of lower status. This was considered perfectly normal and unstigmatized for the active partner. It was just part of the social fabric for elite men.
But conversely, and this is where the profound, deeply unfair difference lies, the double standard is glaring. For a freeborn Roman man, being the passive partner in a sexual act was considered deeply scandalous, profoundly humiliating, and unequivocally emasculating. It ruined your reputation. Our sources highlight that accusations of passivity were frequently employed in political rhetoric to attack and discredit rivals, often successfully. It was a powerful weapon. Think of the historical anecdotes like Julius Caesar himself being derisively called the Queen of Bithynia by his enemies, a devastating insult aimed at his perceived passivity in a youthful relationship. And it's vitally important to note this was a critical boundary. Freeborn Roman boys and young men were strictly off-limits for penetration by other men. That was sacrosanct, legally and socially. So what does this all mean for our subject, our young, effeminate male in Pompeii? The desirability of a young, effeminate male as a passive partner was directly contingent upon their lower social status. They had to be inferior. If freeborn, adopting or even being perceived in a passive role would be a profound social transgression, leading to severe stigma, public mockery, and accusations of unmanliness, loss of standing. This fundamental distinction between social status and sexual role highlights a highly precarious and often contradictory position they occupy.
Exactly. So when we talk about a twink archetype in ancient Rome, these are the closest historical approximations, the figures who embody elements of that modern concept within the specific Roman context. We have the Cinaedus and the puer delicatus. Let's look closer at them. The Cinaedus, derived from the Greek Cinaedus, referred to an adult male characterized by extreme effeminacy in appearance, demeanor, and often associated, rightly or wrongly, with being a passive sexual partner. This term, as we mentioned, was a frequent derogatory slur. It appears not just in elite literature, but viscerally in Pompeian graffiti, sometimes accompanied by the name of the mocked individual. Public shaming etched in stone. Roman authors occasionally depicted Cinaedus with dysfunctional penises or even as having been castrated, further emphasizing their perceived lack of virilitas and their deviation from normative masculinity, dehumanizing them. Yet despite the mockery and the derogatory labels, some Cinaedus were integrated into society, albeit in a specific, often marginalized way. As we discussed, they paid taxes in some regions, they provided entertainment as dancers or performers, often associated with a lewd kineticism of the buttocks, as one source puts it, provocative performance. This demonstrates a complex and contradictory perception. They were scorned and ridiculed, but also had a functional, albeit stigmatized, place within the public and economic spheres. They existed, they worked.
Okay, then there's the puer delicatus, meaning exquisite or dainty boy. This was, as we described, a child slave, often prepubescent, specifically chosen by his master for his beauty, serving as a boy toy, or delicia, a delight, a plaything. Our sources confirm this was a perfectly normal reality for wealthy Romans, which is still hard to hear. But let's be absolutely clear, the relationship was inherently coercive and exploitative. These boys had no say in their situation. Their bodies were simply the property of their masters to be used as seemed fit. Some pueri delicati were even castrated to preserve their youthful, prepubescent qualities, to keep them boyish, as famously done by Emperor Nero to his beloved freedman Sporus, who he then apparently married in a public ceremony after castrating him, dressed in as the empress. This is a stark example of the brutal commodification of beauty and youth under the slave system. It's a truly chilling practice, isn't it? What does this tell us about the boundaries of Roman sexuality and power?
It tells us that for the Roman elite, power was perhaps the ultimate aphrodisiac, and those without power slaves, particularly young and beautiful ones, were seen as available instruments for pleasure, objects to be owned and used. The act of castration underscores the desire to preserve a specific kind of innocent or androgynous beauty, to freeze a moment in time for the master's gratification, to prevent the development of masculine features. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Roman society tolerated male-male sexual activity under very specific, highly conditional terms, primarily the active-passive roles and the absolute status-based hierarchy. Power defined everything. But it simultaneously imposed severe social stigma on effeminacy and passivity, especially for freeborn men. The puer delicatus embodies the ultimate vulnerability and commodification of youth and beauty within the slave system. They were property, valued for aesthetics and pleasure. Yet, as we've seen, this role also represents that potential, albeit rare, path to manumission and even inheritance for the enslaved individual. It highlights that even within profound exploitation, there could be unpredictable, precarious outcomes based on the master's favor. And the Cinaedus, despite the mockery, managed to carve out a social and economic niche, often as an entertainer, a testament perhaps to human adaptability in the face of scorn. When we look at the specific terms used in our sources, like those you mentioned, possibly from a reference table, the language itself reinforces these power dynamics and social judgments. A pathicus was simply a passive partner, a term that could be neutral sometimes, but was often used pejoratively. You wouldn't want to be called that if you were freeborn. A scrotum was a male prostitute, again, inherently low social status, defined by the commercial transaction. Arsenokoites, which literally means something like male better or male fucker, was an active derogatory term focusing on the act. And katapagon, perhaps translating crudely as ass taker, was a highly offensive term for a passive partner, deeply derogatory. These terms and their overwhelmingly negative connotations, almost exclusively applied to the passive partner or those who lacked virilitas, really highlight how language mirrored the profound social shame associated with being penetrated as a freeborn man. The words themselves carried judgment.
Okay, moving beyond the private domestic sphere, as day turned to evening, another aspect of Pompeii's intimate landscape comes into view: prostitution. It was both socially and legally permitted in Pompeii. Not hidden away, really. Archaeologists have identified anywhere from, 7 to maybe 25 brothels scattered throughout the city, ranging from small single-room establishments to the larger, more organized lupanar. Visiting them was common, and surprisingly to us, maybe relatively unstigmatized for Roman men. It was simply viewed as a typical commercial service, much like visiting any other shop or tavern, a need being met. These establishments typically featured small, dimly lit rooms with simple stone beds, built-in platforms really, often adorned with explicit erotic frescoes. These frescoes served as a kind of visual menu of services available, depicting various positions and types of partners. Quite graphic. Famously, phalluses carved into city walls and paving stones even pointed towards the lupanar, Pompeii's largest and most well-known brothel, acting as ancient signage, a testament to how integrated and visible this commerce was. No hiding it.
Indeed. And while most prostitutes working in these brothels were women, often slaves or former slaves, male prostitutes, frequently young and enslaved themselves, were also patronized. Their reality was often incredibly harsh. They were typically slaves, completely uncompensated for their services. The money went to their owner or the brothel manager, Leno. They were confined to cramped, often windowless cells, and completely under the control of their owners or the brothel manager. No agency whatsoever. This came with profound exploitation, a complete lack of freedom, and severe social degradation, known as infamia. Infamia meant a loss of social standing and certain legal rights, marking them as dishonorable outside respectable society, even if they were later freed. The legal and social acceptance of brothels in Pompeii reflects a very pragmatic Roman approach to sexuality, perhaps. Sexual gratification was a recognized, even expected need for freeborn men. But for many of those providing it, especially the enslaved, their lives were brutal, short, and marked by profound injustice. For our subject, if he were an enslaved male prostitute, his day would be one of unending degradation and forced compliance. A truly grim existence.
And here's where archaeological evidence speaks directly to us, giving us a chilling yet powerful glimpse into these realities. Right from the walls, our sources mention explicit frescoes and extensive graffiti found within Pompeian brothels, particularly the Lupin. This graffiti provides direct, uncensored insight into sexual practices, transactions, and attitudes. It's like reading ancient bathroom stalls, but incredibly revealing. Here's a powerful quote from one such piece of graffiti found in the Lupin art itself. "Weep, you girls, my penis is giving you up, now it penetrates men's behinds. Goodbye, wondrous femininity." Wow. That offers tangible archaeological evidence of male-male sexual encounters occurring within these commercial spaces, a boast almost, providing a direct, unfiltered link to the twink persona's potential lived experience, at least within the context of prostitution. It underscores once again the status-based nature of Roman sexuality. The penetrator feels no shame here. If we look at the social acceptability details in our sources, perhaps summarized in a table somewhere, the differences based on status and role are just stark. For a freeborn Roman male, active sex with a slave, a freedman, a prostitute, male or female, or an actor was generally acceptable, even expected in some circles. It reinforced his virilitas, his status as a dominant male citizen. It was fine. But for a freeborn Roman male to be passive in a sexual act, especially with another freeborn Roman, was absolutely taboo, scandalous, and profoundly emasculating. Career-ending, potentially. It literally could lead to public mockery, social ruin, and as we mentioned, even be used as a political tactic to destroy a man's reputation. This dichotomy is critical to understanding the daily dangers and choices faced by our effeminate young man. Where did he fit? What risks did he run every single day?
Precisely. Roman society, as we've explored throughout this, was governed by incredibly strict social taboos, particularly for men, which heavily emphasized virilitas. This wasn't just about physical strength or martial prowess, it was fundamentally about the exercise of power and self-control over all aspects of one's life, including emotions and sexual desires, appearing in control. Public displays of effeminacy, anything from gestures, voice tone, to grooming choices, or, most damningly for a freeborn male, adopting or being perceived to adopt a passive sexual role, were considered deeply shameful, violations of the masculine code. Accusations of effeminacy or passive sexual roles were potent tools in political attacks, used effectively to undermine a man's reputation and standing, essentially stripping him of his masculine credibility in the public eye. This meant constant scrutiny over public demeanor, dress, and grooming for every Roman man, but especially intense scrutiny for someone perceived as effeminate from the outset. A young, effeminate male in Pompeii, particularly a freeborn, would have constantly navigated a social landscape fraught with judgment and potential ostracization. Always being watched, always being judged. Their daily choices in dress, grooming, how they walk, how they talk, their public demeanor would be under intense scrutiny, potentially leading to public mockery or even outright verbal abuse, as the graffiti clearly attests. This created a dynamic of continuous performance and adaptation. Individuals had to carefully manage their presentation to avoid severe social repercussions, putting on a mask perhaps, or conversely, they might choose to embrace their identity in ways that led to social marginalization, but perhaps for some offered a sense of personal authenticity, a quiet defiance in a world that sought to constrain them so tightly. We can only speculate on the internal experience.
Yeah, that's the internal world we can't easily access. But despite these often harsh and restrictive realities, Roman society did offer various avenues for pleasure, social interaction, and personal connection too, right? It wasn't all judgment and fear. From the vibrant bustle of public baths and taverns, where news and gossip flowed freely and people gathered to eat, drink, and socialize, to the more intimate settings of private dinner parties among friends and business associates where conversation might be freer. There were indeed moments of respite, joy, and genuine human connection to be found in the daily rhythm of Pompeii. It wasn't all oppression and strict rules. Life finds a way.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here, and truly adds a layer of unexpected complexity, is that even within inherently coercive contexts, such as master-slave relationships involving figures like the puer delicatus, our sources suggest the possibility of tender or affectionate bonds developing sometimes. It wasn't always purely transactional or exploitative, emotionally speaking. These relationships, despite their imbalanced power dynamics and the fundamental injustice of slavery, could sometimes even lead to manumission for the enslaved individual, and remarkably, in very rare instances, even inheritance, as we touched on earlier. This pushes us beyond a purely transactional understanding of these relationships and hints at the human capacity for connection, for attachment, even within brutal systems. It's not about romanticizing slavery in any way, shape, or form. It's about acknowledging the nuanced, messy reality of human emotion, which doesn't always follow neat lines of power or justice.
Right. Which leads to an important question for us. What about genuine affection and consensual relationships free from the dictates of status and power? Between equals, perhaps, or at least not based on ownership. Our sources provide archaeological findings that offer a truly crucial and poignant clue here. Something tangible. There's the famous two maidens plaster cast from Pompeii. For a long time, everyone assumed it was two women embracing in their final moments. However, through recent meticulous DNA analysis, it's now been definitively identified as two men. Two adult men. Their embracing posture, caught forever by the volcanic ash as they face death together, hints strongly at intimacy and affection. While the exact nature of their relationship remains debated, were they lovers, close companions, family members? We can't know for sure, but it strongly suggests the possibility of consensual same-sex relationships or deep emotional bonds existing in Pompeii, moving beyond a purely transactional or power-driven interpretation of ancient Roman sexuality. This adds a crucial layer of human complexity and emotional depth to the narrative. It reminds us that even within rigid societal structures, human connection and affection found a way to manifest, even in the face of impending doom. A very powerful image.
It really is. So what does this all mean when we try to bring it all together? Where does our deep dive leave us? We've explored what daily life might have felt like for a young, effeminate man in Pompeii, a figure whose modern descriptor, twink, finds these complex and often challenging parallels in Roman society. His day, from the dawn rituals of grooming and dressing, navigating those public interactions in the forum and baths, to the intimate and often precarious moments of sexual commerce or personal relationships. His entire existence was profoundly shaped by rigid social hierarchies and those demanding expectations of Roman masculinity, of virilitas. The figures of the Cinaedus and the puer delicatus illuminate the nuanced and frequently contradictory nature of male-male relationships in Rome. These relationships were acceptable, even normalized, when reinforcing existing power dynamics, like the active versus passive roles or master-slave relationships. Power made it okay, for one party at least, but they were severely stigmatized when they challenged traditional gender roles or status hierarchies, especially for freeborn citizens. The freedom to engage in such acts, or the consequences for doing so, was directly tied to your social standing and the role you played.
And this isn't just history for history's sake, is it? It connects to broader questions. It reminds us that queer lives weren't invented in modern times. They were just often not recorded in the official histories, the ones written by the powerful. Unless, as you said, they were deemed scandalous, maybe sacred in some rare cases, or, as we've seen so vividly in Pompeii, etched into stone as defiant, fleeting pieces of graffiti. The voices from below, almost. A day in the life of such an individual in Pompeii was a delicate, constant balance, navigating pervasive social expectations, seeking opportunities within defined societal niches, like entertainment or service, and forming relationships within a framework vastly different from modern understandings of sexuality and identity. It offers a poignant, sometimes startling glimpse into a past where a remarkable fluidity in sexual practice coexisted uneasily with rigid social judgments of gender expression. They weren't the same thing. And it provokes a powerful thought, I think, for us to end on. Whose pleasure and whose stories are remembered, and whose are erased or distorted, both then and now, by the narratives we choose to preserve and retell.